Don't forget to remember. Don't forget to remember. I've been thinking about this key word, remember, in the Bible. And it's such a key word, and yet so easy for us to overlook it or forget it, isn't it? To overlook it. And, we all forget things. And I'm always forgetting stuff. I've never had the best of memories. But, most of the time it matters not a jot, does it? It's completely inconsequential. Go to another part of the room or house or upstairs because you think, I must look for so-and-so or get so-and-so. Get there and then wander about for 10 seconds and then think, what am I doing here? I've forgotten completely what I've come here for. And it's a bit irritating at the time, but 99 times out of 100, these things matter not. And yet some things, if we forget them, don't remember them, they can have a big consequence. So Deuteronomy 4 verse 9 is one of like 14 times, at least 14 times in Deuteronomy where God says to the Israelites to remember or not to forget. And Deuteronomy 4 verse 9, he says this to them, or Moses says this: only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Now, these guys, we know that a generation of Israelites died out in the wilderness because of their sin. But these guys, these were the children who survived and came into the promised land with Joshua and Caleb. But these guys had still seen remarkable things that most of us won't see in our lifetime. They'd seen the most remarkable supernatural events, the giving of the law, Moses on Sinai and coming down from Sinai. They'd seen, many of them would have been in Egypt as children and crossed the Red Sea. They would have known what their parents went through as slaves. They would have experienced that remarkable miracle of crossing the Red Sea into the promised land. They would have seen the sin of their fathers and, some terrible loss of life as a result of that. So good, bad and ugly, they'd have seen a lot. And yet God has to remind them time and time again not to forget or to remember. Why? Why would he have to do that when they'd seen so much? And he has to say to them, do not let these things fade from your heart, because he knows us, doesn't he? He knows that whereas forgetting is easy, we have to be intentional about remembering. Forgetting is easy, but we have to be intentional about remembering. So this common theme in Deuteronomy, where God says, remember me, remember the Lord your God. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. We must never forget where we've come from. We must never forget how God has plucked us from a sinful life or, plucked us from a hell-bound destination. We must never forget that. Of course, we don't focus on that, do we? Focus on the future and we focus on the good things that God has got for us. But we must never forget where we've come from. We must never forget who we are. We must never forget whose we are. So we need to be intentional about remembering. And Moses in Deuteronomy kind of teaches the Israelites a number of things, some deliberate, you could say, patterns of behaviour to remind them of their story and to cause them to remember their story. And I think some of these things are instructive for us. I've only got time to mention them very, very briefly. But they do help us to remember. So, for example, in chapter 4, Moses says to the Israelites, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and strength. And these commandments I give you are to be on your hearts. Impress them upon your children, to teach our children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads." So, intentionally remembering, intentionally teaching our children, the next generation, intentionally proclaiming our faith. Goes on to talk about observing the Sabbath and celebrating the Passover. These festivals that the Israelites were commanded to remember. We have the Lord's Supper. It's about the only thing we're commanded to do. Why? Why would we forget the death of Jesus? Why would we forget what he suffered on the cross? because the Lord knows that we can become complacent and we can easily forget. We need to be intentional about remembering. Moses goes on to talk about the Israelites giving thanks for their blessings. Psalm 103 tells us to remember, number our blessings, count our blessings. We need to be intentional about that. Moses says, confess your sins. He talks about, he says, not because of your righteousness, it's because of God. Remember, it's not because of anything you've done, but all because of him. And we're to remember that as well. Not to focus on our sin, but to remember it's not of ourselves, it's his righteousness imputed to us. And he goes on to talk about tithing and acting with mercy and compassion. All these things are to remind us not to forget whose we are and not to forget who we are. So that's my encouragement for you today. Don't forget to remember.